So actually, we're now getting into our first big roundtable. So I'm so glad that we're having so many representatives of different think tanks presented here today. And this is the purpose of the 8th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum, which we normally invite 10, 20 think tank heads to present their views and ideas, and then to really talk about the issues that we are concerned about. This is really the opening panel of the think tank forum. So I'm very pleased that we're having so many distinguished think tank representatives presented here from both China and internationally, and from different countries, and from different institutions. And I know that this is really a big gathering, as I mentioned earlier, that first time probably since pandemic, and we have so many 150 people attending today, and later during the section we also have Joseph Nye. He's coming on the road, and he'll join us. So let's start this global order at the crossroads, ways forward. I mean, think tanks is supposed to make recommendations, make suggestions, and also think hard about how, in this multipolar world, how we can really going forward. And as we know, the global order, as we know, since the Second World War, is at the crossroad now, and the world has changed profoundly. And of course, we have recent escalation of conflict in Middle East, but also ongoing war in Ukraine. I mean, the world is unsafe, compared with used to be. So, and economically, we are facing also challenges, slowing down after pandemic. It's much fragmented now in terms of blocks being shaped in different parts of the world, and so the multilateralism, the global governance is eroding, and how can we really, tackle those challenges? I mean, and also China, of course, US, EU, and many other countries, Global South, we really need to work together. And so this is really a good occasion for all the representatives to give their views and ideas and recommendations, and how we can really, among these multiple crises we're facing, where are the way out? Where are the suggestions, and how we can make a consensus of that? So basically, we have proposed some questions, but we don't have to really work on around limited to that. And so, where do the attitudes of the countries converge or diverge? I mean, that's obvious. We've been seeing that on the state of the world and the future and world order. Where are we heading? So, what are the while the state of global distribution of the power, of course, has been also not really balanced sometimes. How can we really be more accommodating and cooperative, and also particularly facing those common threats like pandemic, like climate, and to be exact, and also what are the challenges, opportunities facing the think tanks today? I mean, we're all here today. So what I would like to have is let's have a roundtable discussion from selected representatives, and then we will have some time for comment and injections and Q&A. But let's first. I don't have any particular order, but let's do it in 3 or 4, not more than 5-minute approach, because we want to save some more time for other people to talk. So what I'd like to start, probably I will start with Mr. Rong Yin. He's the Vice President of the Institute of China, the China Institute of International Studies, which attached to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So after several minutes, and I would like to call him from Brookings to talk, and then we'll have Fabian from from BBC, and of course we have Dr. Kahita from Doha. So let's have some sampling of different views from different regions. So Mr. Rong, why not you start first?
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. It's a really great honor and privilege to speak at the first speaker, but I feel really overwhelmed. For such a big issue, I don't think we're going to solve in 3 minutes. Fortunately, I think the last weekend, actually, we together with colleagues from the United States and others, so we discussed a little bit. So let me very briefly to make 3 points. 1 point, 1 minute to one. First point is that it is indeed, as Professor Wang said in his opening remarks, that the current international order, whatever you call rule-based liberal international order, is not sort of sufficient or effective enough to address or to provide an answer to the challenges or the problems that we are having. Now, what would be the ways out, as I think the theme of this session said? I think there are several possibilities scenarios. One is something like we call the bifurcations with representing was United States or other China or others. I think this is not a good one, a good alternative, and we may all agree. The second was, of course, related to the fragmentation of the international order. The last one, which is I feel we may agree, is let's work hard to strive for a new international order that is more just, democratic, and inclusive. The big question, $1 trillion question, is how. The second, which leads to my second point, I think this is, we have to be purposeful. That is, what will be the purpose of this international order? I think we all agree the current international order, whatever deficiencies or problems they have, helped to some way to maintain peace and stability and development. But the problem is that how? So I would quote a sort of a vision, I think, just provided by President Xi in his remarks statement at the last week's BRI forum. That is, let's see if we can work out or strive for international order that will help to build, to promote a global modernization of peaceful development, mutually beneficial cooperation, and prosperity for all. Now, that is what will be the China's vision or China's sort of plan for that. And I would, again, to conclude my remarks in 30 minutes by formulating, highlight a formula I believe that can be simplified. The risk of oversimplification is 1, 2, 3. 1 is a visional idea, concept that the community will share the future. 2 is two platform for China to strive for Chinese approach to modernization, and also I think the BRI, we call it high quality cooperation for BRI. 3 is, of course, the 3G, which you have to take it in a holistic way: global developed nation, the global security, and the global civilization initiative. And I think China is open, China is ready, and China certainly would very much work together with all the community, international community, to implement and put it into action of this vision. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rong, and yeah, very interesting. I think the last week President Xi mentioned about the global modernization. I think that's probably a new term that we have to think about how we can really pursue a collective global modernization. We have some modernization has happened in the developed world. China is catching up on the modernization, and how we can really get a global modernization. That's we need to improve the global governance. So I'd like to now turn to Colin. He's the global governance expert, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings, and has been focused on global G20 global governance for a long time. So Colin, your turn, please.
Henry, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here at this first in-person large think tank gathering in China. I hope we can do the same in the United States. As has already been said, the China-West Dialogue, which I founded 4 years ago, which is with 10 other people from Europe, Canada, the United States, China, and Chile, has had now 30 Zoom sessions over the last 4 years involving 60 people from 17 countries. And the essential message of it is pluralism. Pluralism is the dominant geopolitical dynamic in the world, we think, and pluralizing the toxic U.S.-China relationship by the participation of Europe, the Global South, and middle powers around the world is the way to achieve the complexity, embrace the complexity of relationships and approaches to issues, which can then lead to the professionalization of the dialogue rather than the polemization of it, which the binary bipolar U.S. relationship tends to do. So it's a way of inserting in between these two powers that are having some difficulties relating to each other, other countries with other interests, other perspectives, and that it's precisely the diversity of perspectives which is the power of this idea to pluralize and diffuse and professionalize the relationship. So I'd like to ask the staff if they would to put up 4 examples and rotate them through as I'm talking of where pluralization, pluralism, and non-alignment has fit into the world. And stunningly, I've come upon a report that's just been released in Japan, which will be one of the things that will appear on the screen, written by, or led by Yoshida Soya and Mike Machizuki, who I happen to have known and worked with in the 1980s when he himself was at Brookings. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of this because I think it reflects precisely, Henry, the crossroads theme that you, and a way forward. And it stunningly comes from Japan, who normally you would think would be in lockstep with the United States. But the whole idea of pluralism is one, as an American, that I think is actually in the U.S. interests. So here's how they start. This is the opening 2 pages by Mr. Soya and Mike Machizuki. In 2018, we convened the Asia Futures Research Group because of concern about the intensification of U.S.-China geopolitical rivalry and increased risk of military clash in the Asia-Pacific region. The lack of balance in the Japanese public discourse, you could say the lack of balance in the U.S. public discourse about how Japan should address the evolving strategic environment in Asia deeply troubled us. We saw that not only Asia's future, but also Japan's future was at a strategic crossroads, which is what we're dealing with here. We therefore invited scholars and experts on Japanese foreign policy and international relations to join a multi-year project in order to develop a realistic and moderate Japanese strategy for Asia. The shortcomings of the national security strategy adopted by the Kishida cabinet in December of 2022 confirmed the urgency of this task and the need to chart an alternative course for Japan. So this is differentiation in the strategic policy of Japan, which normally you would think would be in lockstep with the U.S. And I would argue that that's in the interest not only of Japan, but of the United States and of China, because it helps to pluralize and diffuse the tensions that are driving and dominating, worst of all, dominating the public discourse in the global arena, such that global governance stalls out. So, Henry, we've talked about this, is businesses worry about reputational capital. Reputational capital, you probably would understand, is that if a firm produces a product that actually does the opposite of what it's supposed to do, somehow their brand name suffers. And I think one of the conclusions we've come to in the China-West dialogue over these 4 years is that the reputational capital of the U.S. and China is suffering because of the tension and the drama of the relationship and the narratives around it. So I think there needs to be a shift in that. And one way to think about it is, and try to induce changes within both Beijing and Washington, is to realize that the reputational capital of both countries would be enhanced the more we are able to demonstrate to the world that we are working together for the good of not only our own relationship, but the world as a whole, and not just going at each other because of value differences or ideological differences, or what I think are false formulations of binary choices between state and market, between democracy and autocracy, and which are basically destructive ways of framing the issues. The issues are much more complex. So that's the basic point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, colleague. Yeah, you talk about, we have to upgrade and innovative. I mean, this is an innovation think tank forum. So let's do some innovation also. So, on the narratives, on the ideas, on the thinking forward. So this is really great. I think we can't look at the world at the bipolar world and bifurcation. I mean, that's probably very, very dangerous. So now I would like to hear another poll from EU, and we have the EPC President, Fabian Zulek. I mean, EPC is a well-known think tank in Brussels, and I know all the European leaders spoke at your think tank, but also including Chinese Ambassador Fu Chong there. So we are partner with EPC for quite a few years. I'm very glad that Fabian, you come in 4 years' time. Now it's your turn to say something, please.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here for the 8th China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum, and also tomorrow's EU-China Think Tank Exchanges. And I want to give a special thanks to CCG and in particular Henry for the invitation, but also for the cooperation, which has been extremely productive. We've already heard also from Henry about how we live in more challenging times, so I think it's even more important to have frank and open exchanges and to foster mutual understanding. And I hope I will be able to contribute a bit to the understanding of what is happening in Europe and what Europe's priorities are in this challenging environment. Of course, I do not represent Europe, but I believe what I'm saying is the consensus view, not only in the EU institutions in Brussels, but also in our member states. And for Europe, the world changed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because it's questioning the basic tenet of European integration, that economic interdependence guarantees peace. So Europe is questioning this economic interdependence paradigm and whether it has to be tempered by the geopolitical realities which we are facing. In that, Europe wants to avoid geopolitical fragmentation. It wants to continue to foster open trade. It wants to promote multilateralism and international law, all of which principles are principles which China shares. So we are very much seeing there is a common scope to work together. But for Europe, supporting international law must also mean supporting Ukraine to defend its territorial integrity. And that Europe is doing in conjunction with the US, not coerced by the US. At the same time, the EU is developing new mechanisms and new instruments to deal with major transitions: demography, technology, and sustainability, all of which are clearly also on the agenda, not only of China, but on the global agenda. And these instruments will inevitably have an impact on the EU's relations with the rest of the world, but not only with China, also with the US, also with the rest of the world. And what I would very much emphasize is that these mechanisms which are being developed should not be understood as protectionism which are aimed at certain countries, but they are mechanisms to try to deal with common global challenges. And I would actually argue that in those areas there is a lot of scope for cooperation and common working. So we definitely need that cooperation. We need the global understanding, the dialogue. So I'm very happy to be here to contribute to that, and thank you again for inviting me.
Okay, thank you, Fabian. Yeah, for a brief comment. Absolutely, we have a lot of room to collaborate. I mean, we're after all, the world is getting smaller and smaller. How can we really not collaborate? So it's great that China, EU, of course, US, and other countries, we need to collaborate. Now, I'd like to invite Dr. Kaete, and you made a special trip from Doha to China and to attend this conference. You are the Director General of the Policy Department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar. So I know you also had a very famous Doha Forum. So I'm very pleased that you can share your perspective, particularly from a very hot, risky, hot region right now. I mean, yeah. So please.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Colleagues, friends, esteemed participants. Let me start first by thanking the organizing body, the esteemed organizing body, CCG, and its founder and president, Professor Wang, for inviting me to participate and look forward to this fruitful discussion ahead. This conference represents a very important platform for voices, not only from this region, but for leaders of thought from around the world to interact, better understand, and develop ideas that help us to address challenges. The global order stands at a critical juncture. We meet today in difficult times unfolding in our region. Recent events underscore the urgency of re-evaluating the international system. With this devastating humanitarian toll and displacement of population, the current crisis in Gaza cannot be viewed in isolation. It is a stark reminder of the double standards and the lack of justice in the international system. In particular, the crisis has far-reaching implications for global governance at the forefront, which is the fragility of our regional politics. The decentralization of world politics is not a specter on the horizon, but a present shift. Today, across the globe, there are more centers of influence, each with its own political, economic, military, and technological strengths. Additionally, international stakeholders are contending with the rise of more active role for regional actors, adapting the fundamentals of multilateral and bilateral international relations. These actors can more effectively contribute to de-escalation and regional stability. In Qatar, we have always been a global advocate for the peaceful resolution of conflicts and disputes. Our foreign policy is balanced by mutually beneficial relations with countries alike. These relations help us to host and mediate when our partners need our aid, and we will continue to carry out this role for the common good. In our role as a convening power facilitating peaceful dialogue, we see firsthand the flux in global order and to recognize the importance of continuing to work for an inclusive, more balanced, resilient world. Through proactive international engagement and continuous investment in global partnerships, we strive to bridge divides and contribute constructively towards peace, security, and prosperity. The current crisis in Palestine and Israel and the devastating loss of life among civilians accentuate the dire and urgent need for such a peaceful resolution. Although this might seem a very local conflict, its potential to spiral regionally and beyond can happen at any moment in time. Thought leaders and think tanks serve a crucial and ever-growingly important role to inform and influence global policymakers in different areas. I believe that think tanks in this region of the world must closely cooperate with their counterparts in the Middle East to better aid policymakers to advance the existing flourishing relationships, not only bilaterally, but multilaterally as well. In conclusion, the path ahead is complex as ever, demanding concerted effort. Such efforts, however, offer the best hope for a renewed, open, and more important, a balanced, rule-based international order that does not advocate the interest of one grouping at the cost of international stability and norms. Indeed, we should subscribe to a vision of a shared and responsible future, an approach that Qatar has called for repeatedly. Our upcoming Doha Forum, which you mentioned, has the theme this year of shared responsibility. Through our shared responsibility, we can build towards the prosperity and stability of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. And absolutely, I mean, the crisis happening is alarming, and we should all be really very, very, careful of not become a big conflict, and how we can stabilize that is really the key, and all the countries needs to be involved. Now I'd like to maybe get another few comments. Maybe I'll get first from Eric Solheim, and he's the Vice Chairman of the European Asia Center and former Undersecretary General of the United Nations. So we'll have him, and I have Madame Chen Chen Wenlin to speak also, and we have Mohammed Amsi to talk, and also Bruno, of course, from another think tank in Europe. So let's start with Eric, please.
Thank you so much, Henry, for bringing us together. And I'll go straight into the matter. I believe that the 21st century should be based on two words. One is respect. We need to respect each other across civilizations. And the second is dialogue. Whenever there is a problem, we need to have a very detailed, strong dialogue. Look, the one and only strong ideology in the 21st century is nationalism. No one all over the world really believe in any other ideology at the moment. In India, Prime Minister Modi is seeking the roots of India in Hinduism. In Turkey, President Erdogan is seeking the roots of Turkey in Islam. In China, it's become more confusion as far as I can see it. And Europe and America has tended to be a little bit more inward-looking in the last decades. So everywhere, nationalism is the strongest of all ideologies, and it's really deciding the decisions of political leaders. But that happens at a time where the world is moving into multilateralism. We will never ever be in the 19th century, which was the European, nor in the 20s, which was the American. Now, we have Europe, we have India, we have Turkey, we have Brazil, we have Indonesia. Indonesia will be the fourth biggest economy in the world, by the way, by 2050. And of course, among all these powers, the two most important, United States of America and China. So how can we manage this? We need a balance between globalization and nationalism, otherwise we will fail. The biggest burden falls on the United States of America. The United States need to understand that the world is changing very fast. The time is gone where United States can dominate the world. When you follow foreign policy debates in the United States, there is not a single square meter on planet Earth which is not a major American security interest. How can that be? Any piece of land in the Pacific, wherever it may be, oh, it's so important for America. If other powers took that view, it would be a recipe for disaster. The United States need to accept that China is now an equal power and that the United States need to maneuver in a multipolar world. When it comes to China, I believe that China can also be a little bit more pragmatic, particularly understanding that China is now so big, so powerful, so all-important to the world, that when it comes to conflicts and quarrels with smaller nations, say the Philippines or Vietnam, and even India, maybe China could be a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit more humble, and a little bit more accepting the views of the other party. But again, the biggest responsibility lies with the United States, but China can also do more for the multipolar world in the age of nationalism to work. Second issue is business. There are very few people from business here, but it's a center of a lot of what we need to do. In business, we need the balance between competition and cooperation. Cooperation, we all understand, is essential, but competition is also good. For instance, when all the European and American automakers this year have realized how far ahead China is, BYD and all the Chinese automakers are light years ahead of the European and American companies. This is very good for competition because the European and American car makers understand that they need to get up early in the morning, work hard to compete with China. So we should have the balance between competition and cooperation. We need more European and American investments in China, more Chinese investments in Europe and America, and of course in all other parts of the world. And Europe, and particularly America, need to get out of the zero-sum idea that whenever there's a benefit from one, it's a disbenefit from the other. On most issues, there are mutual benefit. Is China's rising, creates a better economy for basically everyone. But China can also do more to make sure that European and American companies are treated fairly in the Chinese market. And European and American company who is successful in China is one of the best bridges across the divide, because that company will be a strong voice for a good business relationship. So China should do more to make sure that all European and American companies feel fairly treated and have access to the Chinese market, while of course the West need to do exactly the same with the companies from China. Finally, environment is an obvious area for cooperation. No one disputes the need to cooperate on the environment. It's a kind of a soft issue where we can easily cooperate. So let's use environment, and that's where the Belt and Road Green Coalition, which I represent, and the Europe-Asia Center can also come into play, how we can use environment as a stand-alone issue essential to everyone, but also as an area which is a soft bridge for cooperation between across the divide between China and the West. Finally, again, I believe if we base the 21st century on these two concepts, respect and dialogue, we will do very well in the decades to come.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, respect and dialogue, that's absolutely true. I think that's what we are doing, actually, trying to do that. I think you mentioned about the climate. I mean, that's absolutely the biggest threat facing humankind, and we cannot really just fight among ourselves. We really need to work together. So next, 我想请这个陈文琳女士。
Now to give the floor to Chen Wenling. Thank you, Dr. Wang. I'm happy to be part of this dialogue. We need, as we're facing the future, as we are in a world wrought with conflicts and tensions, we need some more innovative ideas. The four major issues in the world. On these four issues, the think tanks should become a leader in forming the opinions on these 4 points. And these 4 points are, first is that the world is on the brink of new armed conflicts. We can see that from military expenditure. For example, US expenditure is going to rise from 800 billion to 900 billion. In 2014, Russian expenditure will increase by 70%. By 2014, Ukraine's expenditure, military expenditure, will account for it's 50% of its total expenditure. And we are seeing military spending increasing around the world, and this has used to contribute to this flaring up of armed conflicts. Economy in the world have been seriously impacted. Affected was the UN. The first sentence of the UN Charter was said that the countries hereby signing have this vision of stopping war for good. And second issue, the world is facing a development bottleneck, whether it is to safeguard development momentum or to build up fences to make the world's economy more fragmented. I think this is an area on which think tanks should promote for more consensus and agreement among the governments. At last week, Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, said that we need to bring hope and progress to more than to the billions of people in the world. President Xi Jinping announced 8 actions at this forum. The first is to build a multi-tiered, 3-dimensional system of connectivity. The world needs more connections, not barriers. China has become the largest trading partner with more than 140 countries in the world. Connectivity in terms of trade, facility, infrastructure, funding, and people's minds are with the aim of uniting the world together, not dismembering the world. And the third point is that climate change is an urgent issue that calls for our attention. Whether we should pursue our own interests or benefits of this our own generation at the to the detriment of the future generations, or whether we should all governments should work together to uphold their commitments to reduce at maximum the damage to the environment. China has pursued a different path. It has made 2 dual carbon goals, and also from satellite pictures taken by NASA, 25% of newly added green area in the world came from China. 13 of the 25 global green parks, 13 are in China. China also raises constraining or binding goals and objectives in its 5-year plans. China's new energy production counts for 30% of its total energy output, and it's increasing. And the fourth and final point is global governance, where the interest of one country is superior to those of other countries and those of the world, or whether we should uphold rules and standards in the world so that the world can develop in tandem. We see there's among the total population, 16% of world population are in developed countries, and the rest are in poor countries and developing countries. But we are seeing that rich countries are becoming more richer, and poor countries are becoming poorer. We can see that from Forbes statistics. The military industry, in terms of military industry, the US has taken 92% of total profits. In aerospace, 87%, in financial services, 67% by American companies. In communication and media, 82%. Medicine, innovation, 52%. Of course, this speaks to the competitiveness of of American companies, but on the other hand, it shows that wealth is continues to be concentrated in the hands of the rich countries and rich people. So, what kind of world order that we should look for? Are we going to support this further concentration of wealth, or do we advocate a more fair and equitable share of the profits? So I think that this is an important issue facing us at this crossroads. Thank you.
CCIE, a well-known think tank in China, and her talk gave a lot of data. I mean, you know, we are really has to really watch out all those tendencies on the escalating of the tension particularly in the military front. So we need to be really careful. The next, I would like to have the Amarsi. So I know that you're from UK, but you also watch out on the Middle East and many other regions. So maybe you can give your talks and your observations as well.
Henry, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to such an august gathering, and it is a pleasure to be here in Beijing once again. It has been said that there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are months when decades happen. We are at an inflection point where the world order in which I was born is going through a tectonic shift, one in which we are likely to see a world in chaos and disorder before a new order is born. Questions facing global leadership include whether this transition will embrace a global conflict following which there will be a reset, or will it be approached via gradualism, a phenomena which Western powers have employed to instill free market, liberal democracy in the developing world, but have largely failed because of their uneven application and refusal to accept its outcomes. Nonetheless, I would hope for gradualism than a big bang. This will give time for competing powers and their visions of a new world order to fully understand each other and to conclude that there is more that unites us than divides us with respect to the existential threats that we are facing, including nuclear non-proliferation, climate mitigation, and resource scarcity. But the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East have shown that we could well see a global conflict before a reset. Some would argue that such a conflict is inevitable, but can it be contained so that it does not become existential? Although not ideal, a favorable outcome would be one where conflicts are localized and somewhat asymmetric in nature. But what sort of global order do we really want to see emerging out of all this? The knee-jerk response is that it could be bipolar, with the rise of China competing with the US, a new Cold War. But nobody knows. I hope, maybe in vain, that it will be a multipolar world where military might, economic might, technological, by which I mean AI and cryptocurrency might, environmental mitigation could be led by different powers in a collaborative manner. An extension of this blue skies scenario could also see the emergence of what I believe is the future, which is global netizens, global citizens of the net, transcending all borders and barriers. Whether we transition abruptly or gradually, it is clear to me that many institutions and instruments devised after World War II are largely not fit for purpose, e.g. the UN Security Council. The World Bank and the IMF are largely seen to be supporting democracies of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. And the alternatives are at too early a stage in their development to know how sustainable they are. Cancelling existing institutions is not an option, as no one will voluntarily give up power, and therefore only their marginalization into irrelevance seems to be the prevailing way forward. Based on present trends, it seems to me that a shift in the balance of global power could impose a new order that is not driven by ideology or geopolitics or bloc politics, but where the focus will be much less military, security, and sanction-centric, and more economic and development-centric. And of course, it needs to be de-dollarized. I come from the world of business, and a key matrix we deploy to measure success is return on investment. The West has invested $4 trillion in fighting the war on terror, of which $3 trillion was invested by the US alone. whereas China invested only $1 trillion in the Bricks and Road Initiative, and it's not rocket science to conclude that if success is measured solely by friendship, collaboration, and economic advancement, then China has the edge. Any recognition of this conclusion, though, will require a recalibration of the prevailing diametrically opposite views of world order and systems under which society is organized and governed. At the very least, a better alignment and collaboration through dialogue on security, technology, environment, prosperity, energy, and empowerment will be an imperative. To get there, we might initially see power shifting from the global institutions that I was brought up under to a fragmented but nonetheless more solidified and effective arrangements with an expansionist mindset just such as the G7, NATO, AUKUS, EU on the one side, and Shanghai Cooperation, BRICS, ASEAN, Belt and Road, etc. on the other. Layer on this the African Union, the GCC, and the Commonwealth, and we can see the complexity with which we have to grapple. Relationships are now more transactional than ever before. They will be offering competing visions of a new world order, but only a major reset will dictate which prevails. For now, it looks like the chips might just favor the globalizing South as opposed to the nationalistic North. As for my own country, the United Kingdom, unfortunately for now, but hopefully for not too long, we are busy scoring on goals as we are unable to reconcile the past, which we cannot forget, with a future which we cannot control. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Amassi, from the foundation of Amassi Foundation. So now I'd like to invite Bruno Lehaberg. You know, I know that you're from Brussels. You've been working with European Commission for many years, and in particular also with different regulators. So what's your perspective? And then after that, I'd like to hear from Michael Pillsbury and Professor Si Hong as well.
Thank you very much, Henry, for the invitation to this very useful and very impressive gathering. You ask me how I look at things from Brussels. I'd say that the global context is bad. It is bad regionally. We've mentioned wars in Europe. We have wars at the doors of Europe. In Ukraine, could mention High Karabakh. We see the rise of the extremes, of the political extremes in many countries in Europe. We have war in the Middle East, Israel against Hamas, fortunately, probably Hezbollah. We have tensions all over Africa, Libya, Niger, Ivory Coast, East Congo. And in the US, we have a volatile pre-electoral climate with the fear for the US and for the world that the outcome of the next presidential election is not necessarily going to support multilateralism and make it move forward. Globally, we see a rise in terrorism everywhere. In my own town, in Brussels, we had a terror attack just a few days ago. Same in France last week and the week before. And then perhaps a word on climate change, because I think it has very important implications. The fact that the likelihood of global warming exceeding the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement is, I think that likelihood is high and continues to rise. And the escalating risk of climate change, especially in the most vulnerable countries, are bound to have irreversible impacts on people, on species, and on ecosystems, and as such, on our economies and our global governance. And I would not be surprised if not only in the South, but also more broadly, in many countries all over the world, public governance becomes, in the years to come, more and more challenging and more fragile because of climate. We have, however, one piece of good news, and that is the scientific progress, which is moving faster and better than expected. My second point is on the implications. The ideological polarization is increasing, and this restricts harmonious development, especially as regulatory priorities are politicized. We see polarization, ideological polarization on many fronts: north, south, east, west, developed, least developed countries, democracies, autocratic regimes, secular countries versus theocracies. And I think that if we look at the global issues, I want to get back to what our colleague Solheim said. I think climate is a good example of a global issue which is not polarized. And it's fair to say that the climate change has been significantly, the polarization of climate change has been significantly decreasing in the last years between China, Europe, and the United States. And I think it's fair to say, to recognize that China has played a major part in that. China has implemented since 2021 a national emission trading system, which is the world's largest in terms of covered emissions, and it accounts for 40% of China's carbon emission. But the fight is not over. China is still responsible for the world's 30% of the world emissions. So we appreciate all the work which is being done here, and we are confident that these efforts will continue. The situation is very different with digital. Digital is also a global issue. We have to face the benefits and the challenges of the digital ecosystems. And it's clear that we see now the challenges when governments try to take back control of the cyberspace. And since regulation is driven by a mix of economic interests and values being the collective choices made by countries and region, it's not surprising, against the background of polarization, ideological polarization that I mentioned, that convergence is not necessarily the only way where those regulations are moving. And if we add the dramatic growth in geopolitical frictions and the lessons drawn from the pandemic, and we see that this has led to this new concept, which is a concept which is not existing only in the EU, economic security. Economic security is an issue for everybody. It's an issue for Europe, it's an issue for China, it's an issue for the United States. And I think that the difficulty is when you try to regulate, you see that economic security, it's defense, security, and economy. And it's very complicated to get those things together. Just to move to the end of my remarks, we have a new landscape, ideologically polarized for digital regulation, governance, and the globalization process. We have strong centrifugal forces which are pushing the global digital economy towards deeper convergence and at the same time towards segmentation into different subparts, as illustrated by the US-China technological decoupling, by internet shutdowns in a number of countries, and other similar practices. And I think that the outcome of the tension between convergence and segmentation of the digital economy, this will have a very, very decisive influence on the future of the global economy. So what could be a constructive way ahead for global governance? We've, in my think tank, the Center for Regulation in Europe, on regulation in Europe, we've been working on that. And we see that the starting basis is the fact that we have a fragmentation of the internet. And this is good for nobody. It's not good for China, it's not good for the US, it's not good for the EU. And so we have with Pascal Lamy, with whom I'm co-leading this project, we have started a project called Globalization, the Global Governance for the Digital Ecosystems. And what we say and what we've seen is that globalization with firewalls is not a way ahead for regulation of the global internet. So our goal is that we can keep, among others through track 2 diplomacy, a convergence and coexistence space for the global governance of the digital world. We realize that that space is very, very narrow, not least because the number of people authorized to speak out is shrinking, and that those who can speak do not necessarily dare doing so. So to conclude, I would like to put a very candid question to my distinguished Chinese friends. What do you think about the establishment of those cooperation corridors? In which part of the digital ecosystem can they be consolidated? How broad are they? And finally, in your view, what does the concept of cooperation still mean today in the world's complex situation? I'll be very happy to hear your views on these. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bruno, for the very interesting topic. Of course, we know that digital space, the data, AI, all those are new subjects. But I know particularly you've been working hard on this digital governance issue with Pascal Lamy, and CCG is also pleased to be part of that. But I think absolutely, we are into the new era of technology, and how we are prepared for that, how we can really not fragmented, but how we can unite it on those technology is absolutely the key issue to front. I think you raised some very good questions. Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Michael Pillsbury. I mean, he's the senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I know you made a special trip to Beijing, and appreciate that, but I know that you have been participating in our CCG think tank forum in the past. So 4 or 5 years ago, I mean, for a few times. So I'd like to hear from you. I mean, you being also a typical view in the U.S., and you are a China hand for many years. And so what's your view today? Thank you, Michael.
我可以讲英文吗?
Of course.
Okay.
May I speak English?
One of the worst crises in U.S.-China relations happened when Joe Nye was in the Pentagon. 1995, 1996, China fired missiles over or near Taiwan, very much upset our Secretary of Defense. And slowly this crisis was healed or completed. And it resulted in President Clinton going to visit China. And some cooperative agreements began. So, 有一个教训, the lesson I draw from that is even when we get into a U.S.-China crisis, there's still optimistically, there's usually a way out. And sometimes it's the role of think tanks. I have been a fan, an admirer of Henry and Mabel coming to America so often, that they know the exact differences, the debate between the different American, let's say, top 10 think tanks. One time I saw the schedule of Henry and Mabel visiting the U.S. I think it was 14 think tanks in 2 days. And you and your wife, the Zong Shuji, you knew exactly the differences between Hudson Institute and Heritage and Brookings, Carnegie. Is very impressive. I don't think we have an American, maybe Joe Nye has somebody at Harvard who can do this, but think tanks have a special role to be optimistic, to identify the problems, but then try to think of solutions, or at least a channel for dialogue. And Henry was a channel for dialogue with President Trump on the trade talks. People economists at CCG and Professor Chan here and others had specific ideas. China will agree to this in the trade talks and not that. And this was outside regular channels, but very helpful. Now, I only have 1 or 2 points to make today. One is I'm deviating from the role of a think tank person to be optimistic. I'm relatively pessimistic that relations between U.S. and China and our mutual and our friends on both sides, China's friends, America's friends, the situation is getting worse. 越来越恶化. It's not a time for optimism. And some of the reasons are lack of communication. No congressional delegation came here for 4 years until Chuck Schumer and his bipartisan delegation. By their account, there's a lot of argument going on. The meeting with Xi Jinping was not optimistic meeting. There were up to 50 channels in U.S.-China relations between government departments until President Trump cut them all off. Cut them all off his first year. So you would think Professor Biden, President Biden, would restore all the channels. How many people think Biden restored all the channels that Trump cut off? Put your hand up. Biden at first restored no channels, and now it's roughly 5. And they are very thin discussions between between cabinet ministers. Secondly, the One China principle, or the One China policy, used to be the foundation. China called it 政治基础 of U.S.-China relations. Now recently, the PLA, I think correctly, PLA said, America is distorting and stretching beyond belief the One China principle. Right now, this week, House and Senate are discussing a proposal, strong bipartisan support, to put American weapons and ammunition on Taiwan, to station them there permanently. Then to set up a strategy group between the American Pentagon and Taiwan's military to do joint military planning. Then to continue the American Special Forces troops already placed on Taiwan 2 years ago. This should not be happening. The One China policy or principle should not be violated. The Heritage Foundation recently published a study about a new Cold War with China. We explicitly said we support continuing the One China policy. But our fellow conservative think tank, Hudson Institute, Henry used to visit, now it's been sanctioned. Hudson Institute's position, they sent 我们以前的国务卿 Pompeo. He flew to Taipei, 2次 2 times, proposed diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. This never happened in the last 50 years. So I could give you a long list. There's actually quite a long list. Both sides have 红线, red lines. Each side has been crossing these red lines in the last few years. So I hope I'm wrong. I hope all think tanks who came today will be optimistic and come up with some solutions. But just to make a list, Henry, of the conflicts, 我们必须避免的冲突. We need a good list of what are the conflicts that think tanks could be innovative about. 我讲完了，谢谢各位。
Thank you, Michael. I think that you outlined very important and serious issue. Absolutely, that China-U.S. relation fundamentally based on the the 3 communique, but also the 40, 50 years history. I was just invited by Nick Burns just 3 days ago that he renamed ambassador residence in Beijing as a Bush House. He got a permission from the State Department to do that. So Executive Vice Minister Ma Zhaoxu of Foreign Affairs attended that, and actually we were, we are going back to see how, the 50 years ago when Bush Senior was here, and then things are really, dialogue and respect was really important. So I agree with you that the China, One China policy, One China principle is fundamentally key, absolutely key. To maintain the stable relation, and we all the think tank, we probably have to work hard on that. And you are the authority on those issues. You have been working with 4 presidents in the past, so your view is appreciated. Now I'd like to invite Professor Si Yinhong from Renmin University, also a non-resident senior fellow of the Center for China Globalization. So Professor Si, your turn, please.
Thank you. 3 minutes are so tight, making me skip all congratulations and gratitudes to run directly to my topic. At present, among 3 military great powers, US, Russia, and China, 2 are deeply involved in their respective war or even wars. China remains in peace, but a peace increasingly hot. So for a minimum peaceful international order, a precondition is obviously to be the prevention of major armed conflict between China and the United States with its co-ally Japan. I would like to spend my 3 minutes on this subject. Between China and the United States with Japan, emotional power politics dominates. There's clearly a reversed or ominous confidence in each other. Through about a decade of increasing tension and rivalry, China on one hand and the United States and Japan on the other generally have established confidences in each other's aggressive intentions and actions, with fundamental order of the region or even of the world at stake. And this has become drastically much more established in the most recent years, mostly through military actions. And those about Taiwan, about East China Sea as well as Sea of Japan, about South China Sea, about the Korean Peninsula, about the arms race, about the China-Russia parallel alliance. So the space of confidence building in conventional sense has been much narrowed, with that for preventing military conflict as largely the only one that could be cultivated. In a highly regrettable circumstances, at the present, on high-level male-to-male communication, formally suspended between China and the United States, and diplomatic ones fell largely into confrontation or general rhetoric or secondary and smaller problems. Tasks that should be defined include, I believe, first, to raise further the priority of avoiding military conflict in the national policy agenda. The second, restoring high-level male-to-male communication as soon as possible, and for which the United States must abandon its absolute guardrail definition, and making it more frequent, more regularized, and more higher leveled. Third, working out commonly acceptable principles and rules on military actions over the major hotspots. Fourth, pragmatic approach taken in diplomatic communications, decouple as fully as possible international security requirements from domestic political ones. 5, and finally, to change the ways of so-called information warfare or propaganda, making it based on facts of each other's factual military actions rather than perceived intentions, especially those too generalized. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Yes. Now I'd like to have another colleague from Australia and, who is also attending our conference, James Lawrenson from Australia-China Relations Institute.
Thanks, Henry, and to CCG for the invitation. Look, let me share with you a couple of thoughts on Australian attitudes towards the state and future of the regional order. Perhaps these are somewhat representative of some other regional middle powers. Australia has a reputation, rightly, as a staunch US security ally. Beyond the bilateral ANZUS treaty, we are enthusiastic participants in arrangements such as the Quad and now AUKUS. In Beijing, this can sometimes lead to pronouncements that Australia is just a US lapdog. that lacks an independent foreign policy. But it's a bit more complicated than that. It's certainly true that Australian foreign policy is generally sympathetic to US positions, but that's mostly because Canberra assesses that these US positions align with Australia's own assessments of its national interest. And Australia also has positions that are distinct. Here are 3 data points that I think are perhaps not fully appreciated in both Beijing and Washington as well. The first, in April, Australia's Foreign Minister plainly stated that the era of US unipolarity in the region is over. We now exist, she said, in a region that is multipolar. Australia certainly supports an ongoing and prominent ongoing US role in the region, but Canberra's goal is not to preserve US primacy, but rather to ensure there's a strategic balance in which no single country dominates. In other words, Canberra accepts that the US role in the region must change. I'll leave it to my American colleagues to inform us whether Washington also accepts this. The second data point. Last November, Australia's Trade Minister described US export controls targeting China, devised by the Biden administration, as quote-unquote draconian. A few years ago, the previous Australian government also made clear that it did not support the unilateral tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on China. Now, that's not just because Australia's own trade with China continues to set new record highs every month. It's because for Australia, talk of an international rules-based order overseen by the World Trade Organization isn't just a propaganda talking point. It delivers results. When Beijing disrupted a variety of Australian exports in 2020, it wasn't Washington or Canberra's other geopolitical friends that protected Australia's economy. In fact, trade data clearly shows that the companies snapping up most lost Australian sales to China were in fact American ones. What did protect the Australian economy was access to open and competitive global markets underpinned by the multilateral trading system. When Chinese importers stopped buying Australian coal, copper, cotton and more, those markets quickly redirected Australian exports elsewhere at low cost. And Australia and China's engagements with the WTO disputes settlements process has provided an independent, neutral forum that in August led to the removal of tariffs that Beijing had placed on Australian barley. And just this week, we learned a similar process is now unfolding for Chinese tariffs on Australian wine. A final data point. Australia's Foreign Minister says that our national interest lies in being at every table where regional economic integration is being discussed, and that includes with China. She says this is important. Canberra sees deeper regional economic integration as delivering not only greater economic prosperity, but also greater stability and security. Again, I'll leave it to my American colleagues to brief us on whether this view is also shared in Washington. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, James. Now I'd like to have Professor Wang Yong from Peking University International Relations School, also a CCG non-resident senior fellow, to share your views, please.
Thank you, Henry. I appreciate the opportunity of the conference and the Peking the same. Okay, the world at the crossroads is very important discussion today. I would like to use 3 words to describe the challenges and tasks we are now facing. One is the tremendous challenges we have seen. Is the end of the post-Cold War world order. We have passed the good times of the last 30 years. The world starts to be plagued by greater power, rivalry, and the rising the ethnic, territorial conflicts in the everywhere. So I think now we are seeing that is domestic state governance and the international governance are failing to address these challenges. So on one hand, we have seen the explosions of the wealth growth in the last 30 years. But we have seen the widening wealth gap in almost all the countries, especially in the leading countries in the United States, for example. So we have seen the political polarizations and the rising of the nationalism in the many other countries. On the other hand, we have seen the failure of international coordination and cooperations. So we have seen that is the international institutions such as IMF and World Bank hasn't yet able to prevent and stop the international financial the crisis. The World Bank, they hasn't yet delivered the growth and development goals to the developing countries. The WTO has failed to conclude the Doha round negotiations. Now under the oppositions of the some members, there is in the emptying the working and the operations. So we face tremendous challenges. So to some extent, we can argue that the world is moving to the threshold or the step stall of the new World War. So that we have seen more the signs of the World War I and World War II in the global political, economic, and security situations. Secondly, I think, so that it means the tremendous catastrophes might be the waiting for us in the near future if we cannot find the solutions. The third word is the tremendous opportunities. So that we need the real democracy in the domestic state the governance to put the people's interests, the goals of development, the justice, the more the fair distribution of wealth, and more effective governance in the domestic dimension, in the domestic governance. In international governance, the existing institutions of international governance should reform itself to bring more the countries and more countries on more the equal the footing to reform and innovative, the measures and the mechanisms to work together to address these the challenging the issues. We also need the real democracy to the input in the current and the innovating international governance institutions. So the last word, the great opportunities for the think tanks like us. So that I echoes to the voices and opinions from the floor. So the representatives of the think tanks here should work together and to reach some consensus on these more important issues, challenges, dangers, and opportunities to building consensus on the reform of the state and the global governance. So that we have the responsibility as a scholar, as the experts of the think tank, to show the world the direction and the hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang, and for your very constructive comments. I'd like now to invite Doug Bando, a senior fellow from Cato Institute from the United States. Please.
Well, thank you, Henry. It's a great pleasure to participate. I thank you and CCG for organizing this forum. It certainly is at a time of rising international discord. There's much to discuss. And to give a short answer to James, the question of whether policymakers in Washington recognize their own limitations, I think was answered by President Biden in his speech this past week. He quoted Madeleine Albright about the U.S. being the indispensable and the essential nation. I do not perceive the limitations you may be looking for. I think that we see an international system that is under extraordinary stress. Part of that, which has been mentioned earlier, are military and security tensions. What we see, I think, are very difficult issues around the globe, ones that have the potential for expanding in very dangerous ways. We certainly see in Europe an active combat between Russia and the United Kingdom, or Ukraine, as well as a basically proxy war plus by the United States and Europe, which has its own potential for expanding in dangerous ways. We see in the Middle East extraordinary bloodshed and instability that has been introduced by the conflict with Israel and Hamas, and the potential of, whether it be Hezbollah and other forces coming in, that this could also expand in very dangerous ways with major powers involved in their own way, especially the United States. And we see increasing tensions in East Asia. Certainly, as Michael mentioned, the question of Taiwan and the changes in policy there that have moved us, I think, to a new normal, one with greater tensions and also a set of dangers. All of these are occurring together. We see very important economic issues, international debt problems, especially focused on the global south. This is not new, of course. I came to the Reagan administration 40 years ago at a time when many of the debt problems were occurring at that time. It required restructuring and transformation of World Bank, IMF, and other institutions. So we need to look for ways to solve the current crisis and hopefully avoid it yet another repeat in the future. We see major governments around the world that have their own debt problems, domestic debt. I might note that my own country is one. As far as I can tell, no one in Washington believes that they should have to pay for the benefits they want to provide the American people. At some point, that stops working. And we see other governments around the world that have many of the same kinds of problems. Also, we see population declines in many important countries with, I think, certain unpredictable consequences for the future of what happens in Europe, what happens in China, what happens in South Korea, other countries with working populations declining, even the United States and other countries, we see reductions of increases of the past. And we also see significant social and political problems, both international and domestic around the world. We see sharpened rivalries among great powers as well as middle powers, some of which have their own potential dangers. One imagines, for example, a nuclear North Korea with ICBMs that can reach around the world with multiple warheads tipped with nuclear weapons. That transforms what the North Korean potential threat is in fairly dramatic ways. Issues of Iran and other countries as well. We see peoples divided, it seems, even more by religion, ethnic, and elsewhere. And we also see populism as a political force. It's been mentioned earlier in Europe. We see it in the United States. We see it, I think, in many ways in India and other countries, that this kind of populism, especially when mixed with nationalism and ethnic and religious kind of superiority thinking, have their own sets of dangers as well. The question of how to move forward, of course, it's very hard to answer in 3 or 4 minutes. I think that the starting point is that the large powers have the greatest obligation to find a way to work together and to get past their differences and cooperate and find ways to contain the impact of the consequences of their disagreements. It's particularly important for the United States and the People's Republic of China. These two great countries have to live together, have to find a way to work together, and have to ensure that the 21st century remains a century of peace in terms of great power conflict and does not become one of war. The issues of middle powers, I think, is taking on increasing importance, of how to both counter and challenge malign middle powers, but also to accommodate, to involve and respect middle powers that want more involvement. How to do this is also going to be complex. What to do about a North Korea, problematic in its own way. South Korea now has an economy in the top 10 in the world. India has surpassed the PRC with the second largest population, has a growing economy. We see in the Middle East the problems of kind of ethno-nationalism and religion across the board, from an Islamist Iran to a very different, and it is Israel that today has a radical government, and other countries. We see Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa, countries and other continents that want a greater share of international decision making. So how to bring them in, I think, is a very important issue for us all. And then the Global South, both helping the Global South with its development, but also holding it accountable for its government's own failures. The Global South rightly wants to have greater respect and treatment in the world. That's going to be a major issue, I think, in coming years. In this, NGOs, and particularly think tanks, have an important role to offer innovative solutions and try to move beyond the interests of their own governments and look beyond that to larger interests. At the same time, it's important for governments to respect the role of think tanks, to welcome NGOs and think tanks into the policy-making process, and frankly, to be willing to bear some criticism from those organizations, that ultimately governments can learn, and learn well, if they incorporate and learn from criticism coming from their own peoples as opposed to reject it. We live in challenging times, it has been said, and it's important to recognize this is not just a question of economics, not just a question of money, but a question in many ways potentially of survival. That it's important to move beyond finding fault, but also being willing to accept blame. Many of the problems we face, the blame is widely shared, and we have to come together to try to deal with those. We must look beyond the immediate political gains and look beyond at the larger ends that are necessary. There's much to do. I hope additional forums like this can help play a role of having discussions that are very useful, laying out solutions for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for your very comprehensive outline of all the crises, all the challenging situation we're facing as humankind. And absolutely, I think think tank. I mean, as we all sit here, 50 think tanks, including Chinese think tanks, how we can commonly, collectively address those issues. We're going to digest and analyze all the points, and we hope that we can submit to the respect authorities and policymakers as well. Now I'd like to have our European friends again from Hungary, Mr. Glader Papian from the Institute of Hungarian International Affairs, President of Hungarian International Affairs. Please.
Thank you so much, Henry. It's a great honor to be here, and congratulations on conducting a roundtable discussion with 40 participants. It's an impressive feat. So I just wanted to say a couple of words and actually start with a question that I've encountered already in the last day, which is, why is Hungary attending a conference on globalization? Isn't Hungary the marquee European state that's regressing to populist nationalism or something like that? And it's a fair question because that's what is said in the international media frequently. But actually Hungary is now and always has been in favor of a particular type of globalization that also allows it to maintain its identity. And we believe that there are a lot of states, a lot of middle powers, rising middle powers, and regional states that feel the same way. And so for that reason, the Hungarian strategy is a strategy of connectivity on the basis of preservation of its national identity, culture, and tradition. And I don't want to be too backward-looking or provide too much commentary on the last 30 years, but I think we could say that at times there have been elements of the presentation of globalization over the last 30 years that have too much emphasized an expectation that all cultures and countries would abandon their traditional ways and merge into one gigantic global consumer-driven culture. And the expectation was that in that world, it doesn't matter where anything is made, borders are going to go away, traditions will fade away, et cetera, et cetera. I think we can all agree that that world is not is definitely not materializing. So there are some differences between the Hungarian position and the older principles of liberal globalization. Hungary is against mass migration and is in favor of preserving its traditional family structures and supports a strong family policy. But in fact, we view those as essential to creating and sustaining our ability to make links with a lot of different cultures and a lot of different economic partners. Hungary is the 11th most complex economy in the world, despite its very small size, and given its location in Central Europe, is likely to benefit from a lot of new trade routes and general geopolitical shifts that will make that part of the world continue to be more important. So our theory of connectivity is a little bit different than from the old one, but we believe that it reflects a new and growing consensus among smaller powers that the way to navigate the world is in a multi-vector way, that we can be part of different security arrangements, but also have our multiple economic cooperations. So unfortunately, this is not always well received by some of our American friends. There was an American think tank visiting me in Budapest not too long ago, and they said, you know, you guys really need to focus much less on east-west connectivity between Hungary and Asia and more on north-south connectivity. And I had to stop and ask, well, who do you think is building the Budapest-Belgrade north-south railway? And I didn't get an answer to that question. So I think, you know, we're in favor of a peaceful transition to a multipolar world, and I know that's kind of like that it seems more and more implausible that that will be something that's peaceful. But we believe that it's you know, from our own history of having seen the perils of bloc formation and the difficulties that causes for states that are caught on the periphery of those boundaries, we believe a lot of states are thinking the same way, and so the connectivity project that our institute is launching will hopefully be a platform that we can continue this discussion on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Gladden. Yeah, for your Hungary and the European perspective, it's very interesting. Absolutely, China has done a lot of projects in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and that has actually continued to benefit the local people there. Which is a new wave of globalization forward as well. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Sun Jie-sheng. She's the Vice President of China Foreign Affairs University, which is under the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I'm glad that you are here today to share.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. Thank CCG for the invitation. Also, congratulations not only to CCG, but to all of us for such a big gathering. Well, the theme of this roundtable is Global Order at a Crossroads, Ways Forward. At Crossroads, what's the most important thing? The most important thing is we need to guarantee the direction is right. Otherwise, probably we will not be able to walk into the future, but step back into the future. So related with crossroads and direction, I would like to focus on 3 points. The first one is we need to guarantee the direction of the world order. In the past several years, we have heard different comments, judgments, prediction about world order. We hear fragmentation, division, or disorder, or even the collapse of world order. So the reason that we have so many problems with the world order on the one hand is related with material power, the distribution of power. On the other hand, it's also related with many ideational factors. So far, if we want to guarantee the right direction of the world order, I mean all the world, especially the major countries, need to work out a right direction for world order. We need to guarantee that world order will be more inclusive, more open, can accommodate different actors for the world today, not only major countries, but also new emerging countries, also the developing world. Besides, we also need to guarantee that we get rid of, or we think less about, geopolitics, geopolitical competition, less zero-sum game, more one community sense. Because if we cannot do that, simply we cannot guarantee the right direction of the second point, that's global governance. We have come across different kinds of global challenges because in the past years, probably we talk about traditional global governance problems, but from this year, we turn back to talk about traditional security problems, such as Ukraine crisis or what is going on in Middle East. So we live in a global village, but also we live in a digital era. Things can produce spillover effect very easily. So if any of these global issues cannot be handled properly, and then the whole world probably will be in a disaster. So that will not only influence the security, but also probably the survival of all human beings. And then the third direction I would like to focus on is what is the right direction for think tanks. Because usually for think tanks, the most important thing for us to do is to figure out the problems and figure out the solutions. But I think at this crossroads, we not only need to recommend policy choices, but also we need to do more to build consensus building, because we not only influence the government, policymakers, but also we influence the general public. So we need to educate the public to help to construct a kind of cooperative, friendly, and more one community sense language. Otherwise, probably it will be extremely difficult for the world to cooperate and collaborate at the crossroads. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shen. Yes, so for your very comprehensive sharing as well. Now, I'd like to also, at this point of time, I would like to introduce a special roundtable guest, which is a great expert, Joseph Nye. I mean, he was in China and taken time out of his business schedule attending our conference. And we had the fortunate, Joseph actually contributed a China and a Globalization book called The Soft Power and the Great Power Competition, which become a bestseller, and it's downloaded many times in the internet. And actually we have translated that into a Chinese version. It's become a bestseller also in China. So, I mean, he needs no introduction. I mean, he's the father of the soft power, right? I mean, he also was the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. And I know Joe has been very actively, he chairs he's the co-chair of Aspen Security Conference, which is very high level. And I know he's also teaching at Schwarzman College as well. So Joe, I mean, we would like to hear from you. You've been working in the government, academic think tanks, and so probably it's a good time to hear from your thought as well. Joe, please.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, and my congratulations to you on gathering such a distinguished group of think tanks, because while we have common problems in the world, having ways to understand how each other analyze those problems is crucial. And so my congratulations to your contribution to this. Our topic is global order or world order, and norms matter, but norms in the extent to which they affect global order depend on the underlying structure of power. After World War II, we created the United Nations, but the distribution of power in the world was bipolar between the US and the Soviet Union, and that distribution of power basically paralyzed the UN in many of its functions. So we have to have a clear understanding of the distribution of power if we're going to have an understanding of our capacity to do anything about the common problems that we face. We'd all like to wish for a better world, but without an understanding of the power that underlies it, our wishes cannot be fulfilled. Now, it's very common to talk about the world becoming multipolar. I think we confuse ourselves when we use that terminology. If one looks at the world today in terms of the distribution of power, we really should use the analogy of a three-dimensional chess game. At the top level, let's say, of military power, there's only one country which has global military power projection capabilities, and that's the U.S. At the middle level, the middle board of economic power, the world is multipolar and has been for 2 decades. U.S., China, Europe, Japan, basically these are roughly equal powers. But if you go to the third board, the bottom board of transnational relations, of things that cross borders outside the control of governments, it makes no sense at all to talk about multipolarity or bipolarity or unipolarity. This is a totally different world, and yet this is where many of our problems come from. So how do you think about the world today? Some people say, well, the world is entering a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. You have the era of great power competition replacing the era of engagement. But I think that metaphor of the Cold War also misleads us. If you look back at the real Cold War, you'll notice that there was great military interdependence between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but almost no economic interdependence and very little social interaction. Whereas if you look at the relationship between the United States and China today, there's enormous economic interdependence, $500 billion worth of trade, and there's also something, and social interdependence. At one point before COVID, there were something like 300,000 Chinese students studying in American universities. But something else is interesting about the world today, which is the rise of what I call ecological interdependence. Issues like pandemics and climate change, which were not major problems during the real Cold War. And therefore we need a strategy which is much more subtle than a Cold War strategy of containment if we're going to deal with the problems we face. Take, for example, the transnational problem of COVID, which we've all just experienced. I would argue that different countries did differently in terms of their capacity, but I think the United States and China were both failures. Each of our countries lost over 1 million people. And if you think about that, that's more people than have been killed in all wars in the United States behavior since 1945. So it's something which has not been handled well, and it's also something of great importance, and it's something which may come back. I mean, we may not have seen the last major pandemic. And in that sense, we have to develop ways of cooperating on this. Take, for example, the fact that on the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s, the U.S. and China cooperated very well with transnational networks of scientists who were able to share information and to stop the spread of the virus almost immediately. So the number of deaths was relatively small, thousands. And contrast that with the competition between the U.S. and China on COVID, and you'll see why I regard both countries as failures. In that sense, we have to think about how do we do two things at the same time which seem mutually contradictory, which is compete, which we're going to see in U.S.-China relationships in terms of great power issues, but cooperate at the same time to deal with these transnational threats. And it's very hard for countries to encompass two contradictory thoughts at the same time, but we're going to have to learn to do it. We can't wish away the competition, but we can't wish away the transnational threats. How would you describe this situation then? At Aspen Strategy Group this summer, Secretary of State Blinken used the terminology competitive coexistence. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has called it managed competition. The point that we have to learn is to think of both of these terms at the same time and not focus simply on one or the other. So in that sense, if we think about competitive coexistence, we have to realize that on the transnational issues, this third board of the three-dimensional chessboard of power that I mentioned, one has to imagine not just power over other countries, but power with other countries. These issues, the transnational issues, cannot be solved by exerting power over other countries. You have to have power with other countries. I've given you the example of COVID, where essentially the US and China failed to act with each other adequately. But another equally important problem is climate change. If you think about the damage that will be done to Chinese agriculture by the drying up of the Himalayan glaciers and rivers, or you think about the damage that will be done to Miami or New York by a sea level rise of 6 feet, this is much larger than many wars. And yet scientists tell us that this is plausible, that it could happen. So the idea that we have to cooperate on climate change strikes me as another example of power with rather than power over. There are other transnational threats that we have to think about. Proliferation, for example, of weapons of mass destruction. We've had some degree of success on nuclear non-proliferation, but we now have a new problem, which is artificial intelligence applied to military affairs. And this is again going to require some cooperation in an area where President Xi and President Biden should be in discussion, as well as the economic issues that they'll discuss when they meet at APEC in November. So my message is that think tanks should be careful not to be captured by historical metaphors that mislead. I would argue that multipolarity is one. I would argue that Cold War is another. Instead, we have to think of how do we reconcile both competition and cooperation at the same time, because if we fail to do that, we're going to all suffer, not just the US and China, but the world climate and the world economy. So those are my thoughts about where I think tanks should focus.
Great, thank you, Joseph. Excellent. I think you outlined the importance of, I remember in the past, a few years ago, you were in China, you was giving a talk at that time. I remember you talking about the competition, cooperation and competition. So that is still quite relevant. You know, we need coexisting, compete, but also we need to cooperate. And so this competition is key, and healthy and constructive cooperation and competition are really fundamental. So thank you for your great suggestions. Actually, the book, the soft power and great power competition, has been in all your bags, and we've been giving to all of you a copy of Joseph's latest book that is contributed to the China Globalization series. So thank you again, Joe, for your remarks. And now I have a final guest. We just arrived this morning from Canada. From the Asia Pacific Foundation, Jeffrey Neckville. He's the president and CEO of Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I used to spend some time in Canada. I was a senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada many years ago. So Jill talked about all those threats that we're facing, and climate is one of them. But China and Kunming and Montreal just hold this diversity climate was very successful. So I'm glad you made the time, and would like to hear from you also.
Okay. Can you hear? Oh, there we are. Yes. Alors, merci, mon ami Henri. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and a big thank you for bringing us all together. We definitely need more of this kind of thing in the world, and I think that's come through quite clearly. Allow me to apologize that the adventures of traveling from Canada have brought me here just landing this morning, and now I have the burden of being the last speaker and following Professor Nye. I am, however, unburdened by having heard much of the earlier presentations, and so excuse me if what I say may have some repetition, but I think it actually flows very well from the last couple of presentations. And so speaking as a Canadian and as a citizen of a country that has been active in multilateralism since the first concepts of multilateralism found practical application in the last century, I'd like to focus on the practical issues, the things when we talk about cooperation and competition and the international order. I think it is important every few speeches to bring ourselves back to what is it that we want to achieve for our people around the world in creating systems and rules and norms and so on. And I think there are two really pressing issues that are top of mind in almost every corner of the globe, and they both relate to the changes that we are all experiencing through the rapid development of our climate situation, and it's food security and the urgency for climate action. And I think that on food security, the practical challenge is how we can organize ourselves in this world to ensure that supply chains for food and for inputs related to food production are as robust as possible while keeping food affordable for the broad mass of society. And this affects people at the household level all across the globe and will be a major determinant of the citizens' level of satisfaction with their own governments and leadership. So this is something that leaders are very focused on in every part of the world. Effective action on this and to meet these very practical objectives will require a very high degree of international cooperation, both bilaterally and multilaterally, to ensure that trade is as free as possible, that export restrictions are minimized, that standards are harmonized, and that technological innovations in areas such as alternative proteins and advanced plant breeding techniques can be shared both quickly and safely. And we have seen in the last century the enormous benefits to human welfare that have come out of technological innovation in agriculture, but we live in a world now where regulatory cooperation and harmonization is going to be absolutely essential if we are to make the progress that we have to make in order to ensure that our societies are resilient in the face of climate change and the impact that that has on the agri-food sector. And then when it comes to climate mitigation, of course, as we all know, this requires a very high degree of international cooperation and discipline to raise standards and to raise levels of commitment and to avoid free riding. And this is particularly important, I think, as we go into the next couple of decades in a context where we will have climate disasters that will continue, it seems, to be more frequent and more dramatic in their impacts, regardless of the positive actions that we take on mitigation. And I think there is a huge challenge for political leaders of the next generation over the next 20 years, because even if we achieve a fantastic degree of cooperation and discipline on taking the actions that are essential in order to meet targets to reduce the rate of the rise of global temperatures by 2050, in the 2030s and 2040s, life is going to get more difficult for people in their households all over the world and governments and intergovernmental bodies are going to have to answer to those populations. And it's going to be really important for government legitimacy, for leaders across the world to work together on that, and to avoid the vulnerabilities that could be manipulated by populists, sometimes in the name of financial interests, that could really throw us into reverse on any progress that could be made. I would just like to make a mention here. There's a mechanism, a non-governmental, basically non-intergovernmental mechanism that has offered a practical model of cooperation through more than 3 decades now, and it's based right here in Beijing, and it's the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. And this was something that was conceived at the beginning of the 1990s. It started out as a partnership led by China and Canada, and really focused on China, but bringing experts from around the world and international organizations to discuss the challenges of environment and development and how to achieve development and increase well-being for citizens at the same time as safeguarding the environment. And this has lasted for more than 3 decades now. It's really an extraordinary testament, I think, to a vision and leadership on the part of agencies and ministries of the government of China to have continued to invite experts from around the world to come and have these discussions. And it's a model of how you can stimulate innovation through applied research with a very practical focus. I think all of this, to meet these objectives, will require a new commitment to effective multilateralism. And the middle powers of the world look to the leading powers of the world for this. You know, there are recent behaviors that are not encouraging in this regard, but what we need to do is to form as broad as possible a coalition of the willing in order to urge a greater commitment, a renewed commitment to a practical multilateralism to deal with the shared challenges that Professor Nai pointed out. And finally, I would say for think tanks, it strikes me that we have in the international system many forums, many mechanisms for talking, but think tanks need to be the mechanism for listening. And I think we all have a really important job to do in coming to gatherings like this, in working with each other to be able to bring back to our audiences, whether they're domestically or they're regional or they're global, to bring back what we learn and what we hear. And there's a lot of talking in the world, but there's a deficit of listening. And I'm so happy to be here to listen, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff, for your also very comprehensive sharing of your thought. I absolutely agree with you that we need more listening. That's exactly what we are doing today to gather the 80 think tanks from both China and international, 50 international representatives presented at this gathering, and it's actually the first time since the pandemic that we have this big offline, the largest think tank gathering in China. So very, very pleased that we have very diversified views. We have a different think tank express their concerns and recommendations. And we have actually, the think tank leaders roundtable has been very productive, I think, and the global order, the crossroad way forward. I mean, we cannot solve this as one think tank, but at least provide a very good base for a continuous discussion in the next 2 days. And absolutely, this is so important, and we really appreciate all of you coming here. And so I think that it's important, as Jeff mentioned, there's so much talking but not much listening, and that's exactly we hear. We had, we will also broadcast this after tomorrow, and then we want to have more people to be heard, to understand what's going on and what's the international views on different issues and what's the Chinese views on those global issues. It's absolutely important that we need to work together. So I really appreciate all of you coming. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and we're going to start the afternoon section at 1 p.m. And so we'll start the the event after break, lunch break. So I really, once again, on behalf of the organizer, I want to thank all of you for sharing your great insights, great thought, and we're going to make a great report out of this, and we're going to summarize all your points. So again, I want to thank all of you and appreciate your time this morning, and also thank our audience and other representatives from different think tanks. You have the you have the chance to talk in the next 2 days in different sections, and also the media, the think tank representative from different parts of the world, and also from China, and of course we have a large diplomatic corps also attending as well. So on behalf of CCG, I want to thank all of you. Appreciate your coming, and we'll call for the close of the morning section. Thank you very much.